So I want to ask you first of all, the pressing fact, can you outline your contact with Ukraine over the years? Because that's put a new perspective on this, hasn't it?
Well, it really goes back to my right from the start. I came from an Oxford academic family. My mother was a political refugee from Germany, Nazi Germany, and my father became a sort of one of the first international human rights lawyers, an academic lawyer. And they were among the people who founded Amnesty International. There was no science in the family at all, although my German great-grandfather was a rural GP in rural Sachsen-Anhalt, so southwest of Berlin. And it was kind of natural I was going to go to Oxford and read PPE. But, and the only thing that really interested me then, I did a special paper in Soviet politics. And then for complicated reasons, I ran away from Oxford and was allowed to go back very kindly and got my degree and then went to medical school and sort of straight into brain surgery. I never thought I'd combine Kremlinology, which is what I was planning on doing, with brain surgery, but I did. Because in 1992, a year after independence in Ukraine, an English businessman more or less rang up my hospital randomly, trying to find a neurosurgeon to come and give some lectures in Ukraine to create goodwill, because there was one of the two main neurosurgical hospitals in the whole of the Soviet Union was in Kiev, and he was hoping to sell medical kit in the newly independent Ukraine. So he took me out there, and it was 92 was a totally surreal time. Went via Moscow. I describe a journey in my first book. And when I was there, I met all these sort of senior dictatorial Soviet professors, and the conditions were appalling. And so sort of post-Soviet neurosurgery was literally 50 or 60 years out of date. And I met a very, very dynamic young neurosurgeon who was just about the only person who said, everything is terrible, will you help me? So I started working with him, and I drive from London to Kiev. And Kiev, as it was then, with sort of second-hand microscopes and things like that. And we were doing remarkable things, which nobody else at the time could do. But as the years passed, he became, and there was lots of difficulty, lots of ruthless competition. Surgeons are often very competitive, particularly when there's money at stake. But as the years passed, he became more and more famous and successful. But it was really pure animal farm. I realized too late. He really was morphing into the very sort of dictatorial Soviet professor I thought I was helping him rebel against, introducing sort of principles of openness and discussion and argument and owning up to mistakes and learning from them, which was completely alien to Soviet medicine. So after 20 or so, more than 20 years, I sort of stopped working with him, and I now work with some different people. Less and less, because I am now retired, although I was in Ukraine a few weeks ago, and I'll be there again in a couple of weeks. But that part of it is one of the themes of my new book, which is about self-deception, because looking back, I realized I read into my colleague all sorts of heroic qualities he didn't really have. Just like I read into myself, I thought I was being heroic and transforming Ukrainian medicine. Really, I wasn't at all. And I don't speak the language, and I now realize I misunderstood an awful lot of what I saw. And self-deception is again another part of the book, because of my prostate cancer. I had symptoms of prostate cancer for years, but I just chose to go like that, partly because all doctors, we divide the human race into us, which is doctors who live forever and are never ill, and patients who are all the underclass who fall ill. And one is very reluctant to cross that threshold. And I was particularly reluctant to do it, and left it too late. So at some point in the book, when I first met the oncologist, and I misunderstood what he said. Another interesting thing was that when I was a patient myself, I was so upset, so frightened. I was just like my own patients. I couldn't really understand what I was being told, couldn't take it in. It was very interesting. I knew that in principle, that I'm dealing with brain tumors and things like that. You have to really spend a lot of time talking to patients and their families and do it more than once to try to help them understand what's going on. Anyway, I thought the oncologist said I was going to meet the team, and then he disappeared into a room, another room. And the nurse said, well, you can go now. And I said, well, I thought I was supposed to be meeting the team. And she looked at me in all a withering, nurse-like way. And I said, well, I thought the doctor said that. So she went back into the room where the oncologist was. I could see him through the open door. He was sitting in front of a computer monitor with a couple of other guys all laughing. I don't think they were laughing at pictures of my prostate, but they were just whatever. And then she came back and just said, you can go. And I write in my book, and I said, I thought, I've crossed to the other side. I've just become another old man with prostate cancer, which is, of those who've read John Bunyan, The Pilgrim's Progress, an ironical quote of that, because the end of The Pilgrim's Progress, he crossed to the other side, and the trumpet sounded, when he went to heaven. So that was, I didn't find it difficult to become a patient, in the sense I knew roughly what it would be like. I knew it was a demeaning, humiliating, disempowering experience. So I could cope with that. What did surprise me was just how upset I was, how hard it was I found to take things in.
You did this therapeutic
frightened
catastrophizing.
Well, that's what my wife Kate, who is an anthropologist and a very shrewd person, says I do. But when things are bad, I kind of fantasize about the worst possible consequences, get terribly upset, and then say, well, all right, get on with things. So I do that to a certain extent. So catastrophizing is supposed to be a bad thing to do, but I think can actually be quite creative, just like I think anxiety is in a sense very creative. I've been anxious all my life, but for me that's a driving force to make me do things. There's some recent work published about this. Called Neuroscience. When you're anxious, you get a bit of a dopamine reward when you do something to deflect the anxiety or learn from it. So you don't knock anxiety too much. But it can, of course, be a totally disabling condition for many people. It's in my family, so I understand that.
On that behavioural front, did you meet any Lancelot Spratt types?
No, not
early on. For those who are young in the audience, he was a very bullish, domineering doctor.
Yes, I did a bit, because I did quite a lot of my neurosurgical training in a standalone, very famous neurosurgical hospital, Atkinson Morley's in Wimbledon, where CT brain scan had been developed by Sir Godfrey Hounsfield, one of the great triumphs of old British medicine. But it kind of developed rather like Tasmanian marsupials in a different evolutionary direction from the rest of the NHS. And the two main consultants, whom I can now abuse because they're both dead, were really very difficult. And what was shocking is how rude they were to patients. I mean, it would be unbelievable now, but it wasn't the case. And they could get away with it because in those days consultants had sort of enormous power. And I learned a lot from it, so I don't want to be like that. But at the same time, one of the things that I found increasingly frustrating in the latter years of my career, particularly after being moved from our own lovely, happy, small, is beautiful, standalone hospital with gardens and trees all around it, to this great big PFI block in St George's and Tooting. One of the things I found increasingly difficult was that my increasing loss of autonomy, and I still had the responsibility of what happened to my patients, but I had less and less influence as to whether I could operate on them, if there was a bed or not, and it was very frustrating, and it's a lot worse now. I'm still in touch with my colleagues, and the neurosurgery is a bit sheltered from what's going on in other areas of the NHS. What's so difficult about the NHS is, at its best, it's fantastic. Particularly if you live in central London, you probably will get world-class, world-beating medicine. Well, not free, because we pay tax. But outside, not some of the other big cities, but it's very variable. And a lot of it's not that good. And although there is this big problem with healthcare worldwide, it's costing more and more. All countries are struggling with the increasing costs of healthcare. The NHS has been totally starved for the last 12 years since the financial crash by a combination of the austerity politics and the fact the present government and the Conservatives really aren't very sympathetic to the NHS. They're essentially market fundamentalists and, feel private, people can go privately, which is fine for people with money, but not for those who haven't. I've worked a lot in America, I've trained a lot of Americans, great guys, at its best it's fantastic American healthcare, but as a system it's a complete car crash. I mean the sheer expense and extravagance of it, and America per capita spends twice as much as this country on healthcare, and has some of the worst maternal mortality and infant perimortality statistics, and declining life expectancy, particularly in middle-aged white males, which is actually starting to develop in this country now as well.
I wanted to ask you before we go right into the book, intriguingly, because you're this awful word, iconic doctor in the country. What was the influence of 5 easy pieces? For those who are parents or grandparents, this is quite consoling that it wasn't a smooth path for Henry.
No, not at all smooth. And I've always been, well, my parents are dead, so they can't tell you, but I gave them a very hard time. I'm not a manic depressive, but I have what in psychiatric diagnosis is called a cyclothymic personality. I go up and down. I'm very, very intense in my feelings, which is both so good and bad. I live very intensely, but I'm often very anxious and unhappy and driven. So I felt by going to Oxford, I'd been to school in Oxford and then in London. Going to Oxford University to do PPE, it was kind of, I wasn't being very, I thought I was taking the obvious option, but although I'd taken a double gap year and spent a year as a volunteer teacher in a remote corner of West Africa, I somehow felt I'd been a bit cowardly by doing that. And also I applied to go to the college where many years earlier my father had been a law don. So I always felt I'd been a bit feeble there. And then I really just didn't like philosophy. So I was able to drop it. Because ultimately I'm a very practical person and I like using my hands. I want to change things. And then it's embarrassing, but I had a ridiculous unhappy love affair and couldn't cope with it. And so sort of ran away instead of killing myself. And I came very close to killing myself. And then I had psychotherapy, which was incredibly valuable. And also I spent 6 months working in a hospital through a bizarre coincidence. So I watched that film Get Carter with Michael Caine, set in the Northeast. I thought, gosh, that's a really interesting place. You've got to remember, this is the zeitgeist of the 1960s. So privileged middle-class people like me felt rather guilty about being privileged and middle class. And I felt the way I can really escape my privilege, I'd already been to Africa, that was different, if I was to go to a working class mining town. By a weird coincidence, a girlfriend of a friend of mine at Oxford, her father was a general surgeon in Ashington in Northumberland, which was said being the Charlton brother. Footballers came from there, and they had a very big pit. And he said, well, come along, you can work as a theatre porter. You can do that now. So I went to the hospital, I was given a national insurance number. I was asked by the personnel, are you a socialist? I said, yes. So he gave me the national insurance number. And I spent 6 months writing very bad poetry. I was obsessed by Sylvia Plath at the time. But also decided, actually, I did want a middle-class professional career after all, one of my own choosing. And I was very lucky at my Oxford College said, you can come back. My father continued to support me. And the moral of that story is actually, looking back at my somewhat chaotic life, I was just so fortunate. People were so kind and so helpful to me. And I feel very strongly, it's a moral to us all. We should all be helping people. You never know what will come from it. And the older I get, the more I feel how incredibly fortunate I've been, not in a vain or complacent way. And I felt that almost overwhelmingly when the diagnosis of advanced cancer, I think men will hear my PSA is higher than yours, it's 130, It's a death sentence. Probably a death sentence sooner or later. And I felt I was terrified and quite pathetic. But simultaneously, this is before I knew I didn't actually have metastatic disease. which would have certainly meant I had a very short life expectancy, almost certainly. And I felt terribly strongly simultaneously there was a panic and childish fear. I'd been incredibly lucky. I'd had such a good life, in the sense of a complete life. I like the word a complete life. If I say good, it makes me sound complacent, and I've trampled on a lot of people. I'm sure not all my patients would love me, by any means. But I felt I had a complete life. I'd lived my life to the full. And I didn't really have anything else I needed to do other than to be around for my children and grandchildren and my wife. And that was a very strong feeling at the time. But actually, and it links up, thinking of our late Queen. I mean, actually, if you think about it, what a way to go, to die so quickly after, within 2 or 3 days, no hanging about, after such a full and complete life. And really, we should be celebrating death in that sense, rather than all stuff I feel or pain is so sad and so tragic. It's not. It was fantastic. We really need to rearrange our feelings a bit. Yes, death when you're younger, and most of my patients were younger than me because I specialised eventually in nasty malignant brain tumours. That's terrible. I mean, that's tragic. But Henry, you're only 72, could live in your 80s or 90s. But actually, well, if you look at all the statistical surveys of quality of life, beyond the mid-70s, they all drop off the scale. Yes, there are a few people who are remarkably well preserved. A few people whose brain scans, unlike mine, look remarkably unshrunken, despite their
brain scans in the book.
The book starts with my horror at seeing my own brain scan.
It took you a while to look at the CD.
Oh, God, I know, yes. Because I knew, I was worried. But the probabilities are, as we get older, we're not actually necessarily going to have a terribly good quality of life. And then that comes back to the cost of healthcare. How do we decide how much to spend on the population as it gets older and older and gets more and more expensive? I mean, you can now treat some cancers with genetic engineering therapies, the so-called CAR T cell treatment, which is $500,000 per patient. How do you balance $500,000 for one case of relapsed leukemia against, 100,000 incontinence devices? I mean, it's really very difficult. We could spend We could spend the entire national income on healthcare, and we'd all still die. So there's got to be some kind of yes, it's a bottomless pit, but you've got to decide where you're going to put your artificial floor in that pit.
There's a new book on transhumanism which Henry mentions, and for those who don't know, I mean, I think Jeff Bezos is putting a lot of money into it.
Yeah, Altos is this venture capital.
You're not that mad. Can you say what it is and what you're feeling?
Well, I admit, although I don't think anything is unnatural that human beings do. We are part of nature. Everything we do, including atom bombs, is natural. It's a meaningless phrase to say what's natural and what's not natural. But I had this deep prejudice against the idea of trying to live as long as possible. There's this bloke called Aubrey de Grey who says we'll all live to 1,000 years old and it's all just a question of technology. So I had this basic prejudice. I didn't like the idea. But in fact, you have to, what I do now understand, because aging is determined by genes. I mean, the classic examples are Galapagos tortoises and Greenland sharks and bowhead whales, which live hundreds of years old. Okay, I don't think they live terribly interesting lives. And the Galapagos turtles don't go around at the speed of light. But it is genes control longevity. And in theory, just as a lizard can grow a new tail, in theory, you could genetically engineer human beings to live for much, much longer. Now, I think as an aim, that's a bad aim. We don't want a population. The future should belong to young people, not to old people. But there's a catch, in that a lot of the diseases of old age, such as retinal macular degeneration, osteoarthritis, which I have in some of the distal joints of my hand, all these things we get as we get older are probably genetically determined as well. And it's a rather alarming thought. But all this research into trying to hack genes to get people to live forever actually might come up with very effective treatments for lots of the ills of old age. And if somebody came up to me and said, we can fix your arthritis, or if I had macular degeneration and was going blind, one couldn't say no, but again, it'll be madly expensive. So I have very, very complete things about it. Even though obviously, one sneers a bit at all these billionaires who are worried about getting older and putting all this money into living forever and having their personal spaceships and everything else.
You don't miss being a young man, you say in the book.
No, I would hate to be young again. I was such a prude.
Or having furious libido.
No, I don't miss those at all. And castrated for the prostate. Personally castrated. At my age, that's not a problem. The fatigue and the sort of muscle loss you get with the hormone therapy I find very trying. But I try to continue exercising. And I didn't quite know how much, but it's just but virtue of getting older. If there's any panacea for anything, it's exercise. It's for almost all diseases, it slows most down. So although we shouldn't try to live forever, it does make sense to exercise as much as possible.
You don't believe in the afterlife, you said, even though
no,
you've
I
seen
don't.
so
And
many
I'll
deaths.
tell you why not. Because you see people with brain damage, particularly the front part of the human brain is involved in decision making, moral judgments, being nice to other people. And you will often see people, usually after what's called blunt head injury, where you fall on the ground and hit your head very hard or something, and you get traumatic hemorrhages in the frontal lobes of the brain. And these people suffer personality change. It's very variable, because first of all, everybody's different, and the degree of trauma is very variable, so you can't generalize. But there's an overall sort of pattern to people with that's as they call bifrontal contusions, bruises in the brain. And the patient themselves has no insight into the fact they've changed at all. And they may have some insight into the consequences of it. They've lost their job, their marriage is broken down, they're a bit fed up and depressed. It's very hard to disentangle, you might call the purely physical effects, and more the secondary effects. You talk to the family, and once they've given up after a year or two, and it's terribly sad to witness this, hoping the person will get back to normal, they say, well, they're just not the same person, and they've kind of lost their sensitivity. They've become sort of selfish, and they're just not the same person. They've lost what made them lovable human beings. So if you accept that damage to the physical substance, a part of our brain, can have such a profound sort of moral effect, it seems very unlikely to me when we die, but anything that somehow that there's any kind of human soul.
But having cut lots of brains up, you've got no idea any more than Descartes, I suppose, where consciousness is, or
no. We don't know is the answer. There's quite a lot of research into it, but of course the problem is you can't objectively measure consciousness. The only consciousness you can observe is your own.
Yeah.
And if you're giving yourself drugs or electrical treatment to alter your consciousness, your ability to observe it will go. So it's actually very difficult to experiment on. There are experiments which I allude to in vision, because vision is the one part of the brain you can experiment on a bit more, which are extraordinary. There's a thing called masking, where if you flash up on a computer screen an image for a certain number of milliseconds, we can all see it. If you flash that image up again with the same length of time, but immediately afterwards flash up another image called the mask, you do not consciously see the first image. In other words, something that happens after the event will actually cancel it in consciousness. So consciousness is a sort of looking back, in a way. It's a summary of what's been going on in the unconscious brain. It's said to be a third of a second earlier. And then there's another weird experiment done by this guy Libet years ago now, where people have to watch a clock face, and they have an electric button, and they also have electrodes on their brain, which registers electrical activity in what's called the supplementary motor area, the bit of the brain responsible for initiating movement. and you concentrate on the bit of the brain responsible for initiating movement of the hand. And then the subject simply has to decide to press the button and press the button, and to record on the clock when they decided to press the button. Now, obviously, there'll be a delay, a slight delay between deciding to press the button and pressing it. But the really weird thing is the hand area of the brain is electrically activated several milliseconds before the conscious decision. And that has been repeated many, many times. There's no question of that. But if you think about it, the brain consists of nerve cells and nerve fibers, and it takes time. Thought is a physical process. It takes time to travel between the different bits of the brain. So we shouldn't be surprised if, when you start trying to analyze consciousness, it's weird and very, very strange.
You do come across as fascinated by the mysteries and the amount we don't know in this, and finally including how anaesthetic works, didn't you? Seem to be clear.
It's fascinating. The more we know about the brain, the more we know how little we understand about
anyone
it.
standing at the back of that church in Kiev, seeing you lighting that candle, would have thought you did have some sort of a belief in the numinous.
Well,
so why did you?
I just have a deep. I don't know. I just have a deep feeling that life is nothing without some moral sense, And then, although my parents were both Christian, not devout but sincere Christians, and I went through a standard sort of middle class education, sort of church services. I never for a moment believed in God, but I can't deny that my own philosophy of life is really not very dissimilar from the words of the Athanasian Creed. I used to recite, we've not done those things we ought to have done, but have done those things we ought not to have done. And we are human beings, most of us are deeply social creatures. And I agree, I have Freud called it the oceanic sense, and outrageously claimed women didn't have it. I don't know on what basis civilizationalist discontents.
And you describe that moment in your garden in Wimbledon in lockdown. That's almost not a nature mysticism, but it's good. I don't want to finish this without you giving your views on how important the environmental crisis is.
My children tell me I was banging on about climate change 30 years ago. I make the mistake of I went on Twitter because of the war in Ukraine, but now I follow all these various climate scientists, and I feel increasingly panic-struck about what's happening. And I'd summarize it all. I know that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is a consensus of all the climate scientists, and they have predictions of what will happen depending on emissions, which is carbon dioxide and even more so methane. And they have worst case projections and best case projections. Well, the trajectory at the moment the world is going on is many times worse than their worst case projections for emissions. So, and I knew all this theoretically, and I was familiar with this phrase, the new normal. And actually I was in Ukraine during the 40-degree drought here in England whenever it was in July, and it wasn't so hot in Ukraine. But then, of course, I realized, yes, it's the new normal. This is now the new baseline. We'll have more and more summers with total drought. And you only need 1 or 2 years of drought for the complete collapse of agriculture. And that's the end of civilization. There's going to be massive crop failures in France already this year, which the English media don't seem to be interested in. So I didn't know what to do about it. Should I tell my daughters and families to move to Scotland or Wales or go to the northwest of Canada or what? I don't know. But I can't tell you how serious it is. And yet I was sitting next to some dinner a few weeks ago, some major person in the last government administration who was seriously expressing doubts about climate change.
Do your patients, I wanted to ask you, by the way, you can always come here for a cheerful evening. Do your patients...
I'm sorry, I mean,
it's good
it's
to be
not a
realistic.
cheerful book, but it's rather serious.
It is a book of hope, and the beauty, the perception of beauty. I want to ask one thing about your patients coming back to you. Is that wonderful phrase from someone I've never heard of about you have a patient cemetery in your
Well, that's a quote in my first book from a French surgeon, René Leriche, said all surgeons carry inside themselves an inner cemetery, and it's a place to which they have to go from time to time to think about their disasters. And I think almost all surgeons understand that.
And because of cancer, has it come back more?
Well, it did, oddly, when I didn't know, when I was waiting to find out from all the scans whether I had really serious disease or not, with bone secondaries everywhere, which was possible, which was likely because of the high PSA. I went through a period of a few days, quite unbidden, of remembering all sorts of patients, some from 30 years ago or even longer, who I hadn't thought about consciously for ages. Patients where basically I'd failed. I mean, not necessarily, I hadn't necessarily made a mistake, but in medicine, particularly in my specialty of neurosurgery, you have to bear witness to an awful lot of tragedy, even though it's quickly brushed out of the way and you get on with the next case. And I suddenly had these endless flashbacks. And I thought this was somehow a rather childish begging for forgiveness. That is somehow, I thought about all these patients and said, sorry, I'd be forgiven and I wouldn't die from cancer, something as banal as that. But what was curious was the way there was all this stuff buried deep in my memory. And also, I don't know, they'd been there all along, you know?
Yeah.
And just, memory is very strange.
And you wrote to the matron. Do you think you had a great appreciation of those lower level staff?
Well, I don't know. I mean, we're all very biased in our own favour. And you really have to ask my colleagues and patients what they thought about me. But I do think that having gone into medicine late and having worked as a psychogeriatric nursing assistant for 4 or 5 months, I worked as a hospital porter. I would like to think this made me a bit more polite and stopping to talk to the cleaners and people like that. The sad thing is, ending up working in this huge, big, 4,000 staff hospital in Tooting, you just don't you can't get to know the staff. It's a different cleaner every day on the staircase. And you can say good morning to them and they look at you in amazement.
Yeah.
Whereas in the old hospital, you've actually got to know everybody at all levels. And of course, we're all happier. It's true teamwork, and people work more happily and better if they feel they belong to a community. And an awful lot has been lost in these big modern factory hospitals.
Becoming a writer is unusual, as some of the reviews have said about your books. Why has no one done this before? And I think you're responsible for a wonderful genre of nurses, anaesthetists, undertakers even, writing books, which we've had to make a special section for in bookshops.
Yeah, you go into WX3 or Waterstones, you have tragic life stories, crime fiction, medical confessions.
No, but what was your childhood comfort book? What were your books?
I read voluminously from about the age of 7 years old. I was mad about King Arthur, and I think, I was embarrassed to say this, I think I had a very deep sense of I ought to be of service. I was always terribly keen on sabors. I thought Lancelot was a wanker. Galahad was a pansy. I liked sabors who were sort of steadfast and loyal and got the work done and wasn't on top. And I read endless fairy stories. I loved fairy stories. And one chapter of a new book is a partial version of the fairy stories I invented for my granddaughters over FaceTime during the lockdown. And finally, it's my last book for adults, so I've written a trilogy, which is quite nice. But I'm now working on a fairy stories for my granddaughters, a written version of it.
Before we hand over to you fine people, there's a beautiful photograph of your German forebears.
Yeah.
You've certainly become more, I think it's a message for all of us, faced with what you've been faced with, you think more about them, don't you?
Yeah. Well, as I said, my mother she was denounced as a Gestapo. She wouldn't join the Bundesdeutsche Mädel, the women's equivalent of the Hitler Youth. So she couldn't go to university, which she would have done. And she said she trained as a bookseller, which in Germany, of course, is a very serious training.
Cool,
to sell books. She could wrap books, unbelievably well. Give it a bit of brown paper and a piece of string. Miraculous. A lost art. Anyway, there were one or two other people in the bookshop who shared her anti-Nazi views, and they were denounced by somebody. Her friends were tried and sent to prison. One of them died there. She was told by the Gestapo they wouldn't prosecute her, but she'd have to appear as a witness in her friend's trial. And she felt she couldn't cope with that, and because already met my father, had gone to Germany to learn English. And I've been to cut a long story short, to a certain extent, he married her so she could get out of Germany. It was a very successful marriage. But her sister, Sabina, was a fanatical Nazi, so she and my mother parted on the worst of terms. And her brother, Hans Marquardt, whom I knew, was a super uncle, but died of alcoholism, was the Luftwaffe Messerschmitt fighter race. And there's this lovely photograph of them in the book in Magdeburg, where they grew up in 1929. They'd been through hyperinflation. Her father was a school teacher. They'd lost most of their savings. The Nazis were on the rise. There were street fights with communists. But they had this very, very happy childhood, and she wrote a beautiful memoir about it. And I have this photograph on the wall in my kitchen. I look at it every day and look at my mother. It's kind of weird looking at your own mother at the age of 11, but also thinking they could have had no idea of what the future held for them, only 10 years away. And so my book ends with a photograph of my 3 granddaughters with their backs turned to the camera, because I don't know what's going to happen to them. So it ends on a slightly somber note, and I'd say it's a hopeful book because I've had a really very complete life, and then it comes back to the assisted dying business, which I'm a great believer in. But that for me is now simply a question of evidence, because there are so many countries where it is legalized, and the arguments produced against it by a small group of people in this country, mainly senior palliative care doctors. Basically, it's a question of evidence. Are elderly, vulnerable, disabled people being neglected or harassed or bullied into asking to help end their life? And it's not happening.
And you point out the irony that a lot of opposition to abortion and assisted dying is from religious people who...
Well, it is odd, isn't it? You might think if we're all going to go to heaven afterwards and the trumpets sound, why delay? Get on with it. I mean, it sounds silly, but it's a valid objection. Why is there obsession? I mean, don't get me wrong, for most people, dying is always very upsetting, particularly if there's a family who are going to be left behind. But with modern palliative care, for most people, it's not a terrible physical experience. For a small number of people, it is, despite good palliative care. And in my second book, I describe one such death. But also, when you look at opinion surveys of people who've opted for assisted dying, most of the work comes from America, particularly from our state of Oregon, which has had assisted dying now for many years, decades. The 90% of people say it's the loss of autonomy and dignity which can come with your final illness, which people want to avoid. I have prostate cancer. It typically spreads to the skeleton. I'm an informed consumer. I must have operated upon not dozens but hundreds of old men who are becoming paralyzed from prostate metastatic disease in the spine. Surgery only postpones paralysis. It doesn't stop it. Certainly doesn't stop the illness. And I think, look, if I end up doubly incontinent, paralyzed in bed from metastatic disease in my spine, I may decide that's fine, I'll hang on to the end. But at the man I am at the moment, I would like to feel I have a choice, subject to suitable legal safeguards. And it's all about legal safeguards to avoid. And the other thing about, the crazy thing about, there are two things to conclude about the complete inconsistencies in this country. Firstly, the Mental Capacity Act of 2004, it is our legal right to refuse further treatment, and doctors have to respect your view. And if you're said, well, you can have another round of chemotherapy, which may or may not keep you alive a bit longer, you are legally allowed to say, I don't want it, I would rather die. And that is in the law. But you're not allowed to say when or how or where. And secondly, the law makes no distinction in the Suicide Act between encouraging suicide and assisting it, if it is a carefully considered request. And the law is no problem in family law, the idea of coercive behaviour. So there's no reason why you can't legislate to against encouraging suicide, but permitting it subject to suitable safeguards. And there are so many different ways of doing it in so many countries now. And they've all looked at the statistics and thought about it. So we need an inquiry, some kind of public inquiry in this company, where all this can be aired and discussed. Opinion polls show a huge majority in favour of changing the law in some way. Obviously, there are lots of ways of doing that. And I'm sure it will come. It's like gay marriage. Does gay marriage destroy the institution of the family? Well, no. It's something called human nature. Anyway, that's enough on systems.
Well, before we throw it open for questions, I just want to say I found it a massively hopeful book, and I think that's because awareness of death is so powerful. As Camus said, if you're aware of death, anything is possible. But are there any questions about anything? Oh, there's someone at the back. We didn't have the traditional silence. Yeah, do
That's
speak
very
up.
quick. You must have planted the person.
She's not planted.
I was very interested in your ideas on the afterlife. I was wondering if you could give a neurological explanation for near-death experiences.
Well, there's near-death experiences. Well, they're real. There's no doubt about that, because it's mainly people who've fallen near drownings, few people falling out of aeroplanes without a parachute, landing on snow-covered trees. Quite a lot of people falling when skiing off mountains and landing in deep snow. I don't see why this is evidence for an afterlife. These are people who survived, and many of them report a very profound spiritual experience. But I don't doubt that for a moment. That maybe if you realise you're dying, there's a great feeling of peace and calm. I mean, there's always very interesting work being done now with psychedelic drugs for terminal care, as well as for depression and other conditions. And apparently this is David Nutt in London. One dose of psilocybin, which is the active ingredient in magic mushrooms, with suitable environment and help, has remarked profound effects on helping people accept their own death if they're dying. So there are lots of things we don't understand, but I had mystical experiences myself when I was a teenager. I don't see this as evidence of anything outside my brains, but evidence that there's an awful lot we don't understand.
Gentleman here. You want to have this? It's so close to you. I'll give you the mic.
You said you were asked if you were a socialist when you went to Washington. But why did they ask you that?
I think because I had a very posh accent, and it was totally weird having this long-haired young man with a sort of Oxford accent coming to work in Ashington as a theatre porter. So we didn't know what to make of me, I think is the answer. But I was a socialist then, and I am still sort of now, at least to the extent I think that inequality is an absolute terrible curse on our society at the moment. We need a wealth tax, desperately need a wealth tax, let alone a windfall tax on the energy company. I mean, if you want any, and I'm not in just like I did some private medical practice. I'm not totally against privatization or whatever. But what's happened with the water companies really is extraordinary. When they were privatized under Margaret Thatcher, the argument was this will attract lots of private investment. What happened? They invested nothing, and all the money, they raised some money, it all went into paying dividends to shareholders. And I mean, it's unbelievable. They're putting sewage into the rivers. The River Wye is dead. But that's a different thing, because of chicken farming. So, I mean, we've gone backwards. And the idea that beaches now have got "is not safe to bathe" signs. I mean, this is staggering. And that is, I mean, capitalism is fine, but the whole idea of the greed of capitalism, greed is good, Adam Smith, the invisible hand, is competition. That is what makes it good, because it's competitive. And there was the regulators were hopeless. There's no competition in the privatized energy, or the energy ones a bit, but certainly not in the water businesses. So it was a disaster.
Is there anyone else? Hopefully nobody works for Southern Water. Something back.
Good evening, Mr. Marsh. Just as a doctor and as a patient, what advice would you give to anyone who has been diagnosed with cancer, from your perspective?
Well, an awful lot of the interface now it depends. It depends on, doctors are variable, departments are variable. A lot of the interfaces with specialist nurses, and the ones I've seen are all excellent, but they're not responsible for making the decisions in your treatment. So, as I say in my book, it's rather disempowering in some ways. I would have preferred to see the consultant more often than I did. There's a good friend of mine called Robert McCrum, who was a literary editor, a very eminent one, and then had a stroke in his 40s, and wrote a very good book called My Year Off, and he was paralysed in bed for months. And he talks about the way he just had to be frightfully polite to the nurses and deferential. It's a very, very unequal relationship. It's very difficult. You might have seen that article in The Guardian recently by Merripe Mills, whose daughter died completely avoidably from a bizarre sort of bicycle handlebar injury to a pancreas. And she died from neglected sepsis in one of the big, prestigious London teaching hospitals. And she writes how, she and her husband, how they curse themselves for having trusted the doctors. And yet it's intolerable not to trust the doctors. It's very difficult to get that. It's a real problem. On the one hand, as a patient, if you don't stand up for yourself and cause a bit of a fuss, you'll not get the best treatment. The squeaky wheel gets the oil. But you have to at the same time not kind of, disingratiate yourself. I mean, rationally, if the doctor-patient relationship was a rational transaction, there'd only be two questions you'd ask the doctor, particularly with anything. What would you do if it was you? And if it's a surgeon, how many of these operations have you done? Those are the rational questions to ask. I think I was scarcely ever asked that in my whole of my career. And that's because it's such an incredibly unequal relationship. And we have to trust our doctors. But on the whole, I would encourage people to be a little bit difficult, politely, but a bit demanding and questioning, and not take everything as said. I think, coming back to the Guardian writer, I mean, I might be very silly of the doctors to neglect the daughter of a leading journalist, but that's a cynical view.
Lady in red has a question.
Yeah, I lost a beloved partner to glioblastoma, which,
Yeah.
as you know, is the most dreadful.
Yeah.
And your books were a great comfort and very useful. But what is your opinion on the medical profession finding better treatment for that dreadful disease?
Well, I'm afraid the answer is very disappointing. There's lots of research. I think it's a bit of an orphan illness. It doesn't attract. There are in England there are 4,000 new brain tumour cases in total a year, 40,000 cases of breast cancer. So it's a minority illness. There's quite a lot of research, but the brutal truth is that over the last 50 years, there's been no significant improvement. We know there are a few long-term survivors. About 5% of people are alive after several years, but we don't know why. We've perhaps got a bit better at identifying who might live longer, depending on the genetics of a tumour. But in terms of definitive treatment, no. And that, of course, is because it's the brain. The brain is soft, jelly-like, the tumour grows into it. The brain is very vulnerable. You can't hit it with a hammer. You can't cut the tumour out as you can. If you have a sarcoma in the leg, in theory, you can amputate the whole leg, but you can't do that with the brain. So at the moment, I'm afraid to say, there's no real progress. And it's not a total death sentence. I would tell patients, well, if you're unusually lucky, you might be alive in a few years' time, but it's unusual.
A couple more questions. This lady here in black and purple.
Thank you. I've got a question for you as a writer and as author.
Yeah.
You were saying earlier this evening about self-deception and the power of hindsight.
Yes.
With that knowledge, how would you write your books now in terms of the ethics of storytelling? Are there any kind of particular stories that you feel you should have told differently? Would you tell them differently? And how did you make the choices at the time?
The stories are all from my diary. I've kept a diary virtually every day since the age of 12. So although I'd often when I'm asked why did you write the first book, I said, well, my wife told me to. And why was that? My wife is Kate Fox, who's an anthropologist who wrote a book called Watching the English, which is absolutely brilliant and very funny and very clever.
Which we
She's very funny.
by the way.
Very clever. And when we met after the end of my first marriage, 23 years ago now, and she had asked me what were you doing at work, and I'd read a bits of my diary. She said, oh, well, your book, go and see my literary agent. So I then spent sort of 10 years sort of muddling about. To be honest, I haven't reread either of the first two books. I find it quite difficult. I'm not aware of anything I'd want to rewrite now, on the whole. The aim, although I tell a few stories of success, the aim was always trying to be fairly brutally honest, on the whole, because that struck me as being A, more interesting, and B, more important. I didn't particularly want to set off an avalanche of other medical memoirs, though it has to a certain extent. But I do feel very, very strongly that Jeremy Hunt's written this book, which actually is not bad, called Zero. In fact, it's very good, actually. He asked me to do a puff, and I said, well, I've got to use a very long spoon, you know. But because he was only, and his heart's in the right place, and each chapter starts with a horrific story of some awful disaster in the NHS, and the family, at his suggestion, coming to talk to him about it, and he's all about the importance of having a no-blame culture, learning from mistakes, which is terribly difficult for doctors to admit to making mistakes. And I feel very strongly senior doctors like myself, at least in private with colleagues and trainees, should set an example of being ruthlessly honest. And I took it one step further by doing it in public. Only once was I asked, in fact in Ukraine, now why do you write this book? Because the book was very successful in Ukraine, in translation. Now, why do you write this book? It will upset patients. And of course, there's a paradox. They said we have to trust doctors, but how can you trust somebody if they're not honest? So in a funny sort of way, an honest doctor who admits to vulnerability, fallibility, in some ways is more trustworthy. But as patients, we don't want to think that. We want to think, oh, God's a superhuman powers, because we're so frightened and anxious. So it's this very awkward balance.
A last question. Oh, there's a lady there.
It kind of follows on from what you were just saying. So I'm wondering about the hierarchy between doctors, nurses, and patients.
Yeah.
So you must have seen a lot of change, I imagine, in the time you've worked between sort of doctors and nurses.
Yes, a lot. In terms of myself, I would occasionally lose my temper, which I always regretted and I always apologised afterwards. But it was kind of acceptable. If you had in theatre, if you had sensible theatre nurses, they knew that, you know, surgeons sometimes are very stressed and getting a bit angry is a way of trying to cope with it. But there are degrees, and some people's behaviour wasn't acceptable. But now you really have to bottle it up completely, you know, you must be terribly, terribly polite, and you mustn't get too cross or anything.
You've got your 20-page dress code as well.
Well, that's right, which makes it quite difficult. In terms of relationship with the nurses, I like to think I always got on well with nurses, partly because I'd worked as one myself. I'm sure you'd find some who said Marsh was an arrogant sod. I hope not too many. I feel very sorry for the new generation of junior doctors, because they work these much shorter rotas, a working week, and they're much better. They don't have to work all the hours of the day. But it means they didn't really get no staff in the same way. In my generation, I'm not saying we should go back to quite the insane hours I worked. But also, you know, when I was working long hours, you weren't actually working all the time. It's become much more intense in hospital now. But it means they don't have the same relationship. You just, because teamwork is all about knowing people and spending time and getting to know them as individuals and people. And that's increasingly difficult in the way the NHS functions now.
Absolutely, the utterly final question for you. I've got
Alzheimer's.
Yeah.
Alzheimer's. are we going to be able to manage it, and when will we be able to cure it?
Well, the incidence of Alzheimer's in this country is actually going down a bit, but the number of people with Alzheimer's is going up because it's an age-related condition. And yes, there are some genetic forms where people get it much earlier, so-called pre-senile Alzheimer's. The depressing thing about Alzheimer's is despite a huge amount of research, there's been zero progress. And most of the big pharmaceutical companies are moving out of Alzheimer's research. It is a big problem because it's an expensive disease, care homes, and you saw ghastly scenes in COVID, particularly in Spain, where all the staff had disappeared and the whole sort of building was full of dead people. It's a big problem. It's going to be a huge problem in countries like Brazil and Nigeria. They've got a vast baby boom. We'll have a huge population of demented people in 40 years' time. No, I don't know what the answer is. I mean, all I can say is we do know that 30% of the risk is lifestyle. I mean, still 60% is age and genes. But exercise, education, the older you are when you finish higher education, the lower your risk. But it's multifactorial. You know, Iris Murdoch got Alzheimer's, Claude Shannon, the great information theory pioneer, got Alzheimer's. So there's no perfect solution to it. But in my more sardonic moments in my book, I say, well, actually, if I die from prostate cancer in a few years' time, that means I don't have to worry about getting Alzheimer's. So that's not to be sneezed at, even though it's a very uncomfortable thought. Because we're all so frightened about dying, and so we have this deep innate fear. But it's a big problem, is the answer. And at the moment, there's no, and even the theory, all the theories, it's said to be due to amyloid deposition, but even that's disputed. So the actual fundamental mechanisms aren't really understood either.